The power of self-denial, embracing the call to Christian discipleship. For Christians, self-denial is not just a personal practice or a means to social justice, it is also a fundamental aspect of discipleship. Self-denial is the act of denying oneself something, such as food, material possessions, or personal desires, for the sake of a higher purpose. In Christian discipleship, self-denial is the intentional act of putting aside one's desires and interests to follow Jesus Christ. This article will explore the role of self-denial in Christian discipleship, share examples of people who have answered the call to follow Jesus through acts of self-denial, and how it can strengthen our relationship with God and our community.
Self-denial in Christian discipleship. Self-denial is a central theme in Christian discipleship. Jesus himself said, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Mark 8 verse 34. These words, spoken by Jesus to his disciples, are a call to self-denial. To follow Christ means to put aside our interests, desires, and ambitions, and to put him first in our lives. Self-denial is not easy. Our natural inclination is to pursue our desires and interests. We want to be comfortable, happy, and fulfilled. But Jesus calls us to something more. He calls us to take up our cross and follow him. This means putting aside our desires and interests and following him wherever he leads us. Self-denial is not just about giving up things. It's about putting aside our own desires and interests and following Jesus. It's about living a life of surrender to him. This is not something that comes naturally to us. It's something that we must intentionally cultivate in our lives.
Examples of self-denial in Christian discipleship. Throughout history, there have been many examples of people who have answered the call to follow Jesus through acts of self-denial. The Apostle Paul is perhaps one of the most well-known examples. He gave up his position of power and influence as a Pharisee to follow Jesus. He endured countless hardships, including imprisonment, beatings, and shipwrecks, all for the sake of the gospel. Another example is Mother Teresa, who devoted her life to serving the poor and sick in India. She gave up her comfort and safety to serve those in need. She once said, "I have found the paradox, that if you love until it hurts, there can be no more hurt, only more love." There are countless other examples of people who have answered the call to follow Jesus through acts of self-denial. Each of these examples teaches us something about what it means to follow Jesus. It means putting aside our own desires and interests and serving others. It means living a life of sacrifice for the sake of the gospel.
The challenge of self-denial. Self-denial is not easy. It goes against our natural inclinations. We want to be comfortable, happy, and fulfilled. We don't want to give up our desires and interests. But Jesus calls us to something more. He calls us to take up our cross and follow him. Self-denial is a challenge because it requires us to confront our selfishness. It requires us to put aside our desires and interests and put others first. This is not something that comes naturally to us. It's something that we must intentionally cultivate in our lives. Self-denial is also a challenge because it requires us to trust in God's provision. When we give up something that we desire, we may feel like we are missing out on something good. But when we trust in God's provision, we know that He will give us everything that we need.
How self-denial can strengthen our faith. self-denial can strengthen our faith in several ways. First, it helps us to focus on what is truly important. When we put aside our desires and interests, we can focus on serving God and others. This helps us to live a life of purpose and meaning. Self-denial also helps us to grow in our dependence on God. When we give up something that we desire, we are forced to rely on God's provision. This can help us to grow in our faith and trust in Him. Finally, self-denial can help us to grow in our love for others. When we put others first, we can show them the love of Christ. This can help us to build deeper relationships with others and to share the gospel with them.
Living a life of self-denial as a Christian disciple. Living a life of self-denial as a Christian disciple requires intentionality and discipline. It means putting aside our desires and interests and putting others first. It means living a life of sacrifice for the sake of the gospel. One way to cultivate self-denial in our lives is through fasting. Fasting is the intentional act of giving up food or some other pleasure for some time. It is a way to put aside our desires and focus on God. Another way to cultivate self-denial is through giving. Giving is the act of giving away our resources, such as money or time, to others. It is a way to put others first and show them the love of Christ. Prayer is also an important way to cultivate self-denial in our lives. Prayer is the act of communicating with God. When we pray, we can put aside our desires and focus on God's will for our lives.
Practical steps for practicing self-denial in Christian discipleship. Here are some practical steps for practicing self-denial in Christian discipleship. 1. Fast regularly. Set aside time to fast food or some other pleasure. 2. Give generously. Give away your resources, such as money or time, to others. 3. Pray regularly. Communicate with God and focus on His will for your life. 4. Serve others. Look for opportunities to serve others and put their needs before your own. 5. Read the Bible. Read the Bible regularly to learn more about what it means to follow Jesus. Self-denial is a central theme in Christian discipleship. It is the intentional act of putting aside our own desires and interests to follow Jesus Christ. Self-denial is not easy, but it can strengthen our faith and help us to grow in our love for God and others. By practicing self-denial in our lives, we can become more like Christ and fulfill our calling as Christian disciples.